So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jennifer and Hannah and Lisa, for organizing what I know will be a really interesting day today. I'm going to just tell you some about the Archives of American Art. Who are we? What do we do? And then tell you a little bit about some challenges we faced with one recent collection, which will be recognizable to many of you, I'm sure, as challenges that we're all facing in the field. Now, let's see. Okay. The Archives of American Art was founded in Detroit in 1954 as an independent organization, only becoming part of the Smithsonian in 1970. At the time of our founding, the field of art history was in its infancy, with only a handful of general surveys, a few early monographs and biographies, and several specialized studies having been published. Few universities offered graduate studies in the field. The primary sources needed to fuel scholarship were either in private hands or scattered across institutions around the country, making serious research on the history of American art difficult. The founders knew that for the field to grow, primary source material must be gathered and preserved and made as easily accessible to scholars as possible. The archives began collecting in the year of our founding, with early acquisitions including Martin Johnson Head's Hummingbird Notebook, believed to be an introduction to a never-realized Audubon-like book on hummingbirds, and Horace Pippin's illustrated memoirs from his time in the Harlem Hellfighters Unit in World War I. The archive's initial philosophy was to borrow papers, microfilm them, and return them. But the founders soon realized the importance of preserving the originals, and collecting of originals began in the mid-1950s. Today, we have more than 6,000 manuscript collections, and our collections continue to grow every year, with recent acquisitions including the Roy Lichtenstein papers and the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation records, and the papers of Howardina Pindell, Joan Semmel, Jean Swenson, Paul Henry Ramirez, Sengen Ngugi, Richard Tuttle, and others. Oh, okay, sorry, it's not advancing on its timer. So here's a bunch of our stuff that was supposed to be going by while I was talking. Okay, there we go. Now, that one's working. Our oral history program began in 1958 and is unparalleled in its depth of firsthand accounts of key figures of the American art world. With nearly 2,400 interviews, this collection has captured the voices of artists, curators, collectors, dealers, and scholars for more than 60 years. Each year, we add 30 to 40 new interviews to the collection, with current and recent special projects focusing on Latino, African American, and LGBT artists. We highlight scholarship on our collections, both by our own staff and by outside scholars, through exhibitions, public programs, our blog, and through the prestigious Archives of American Art Journal, published twice a year. Since its founding, the collections of the Archives of American Art have been essential, all right, here we go again, to thousands of books, dissertations, exhibitions, and other programs on the art of the United States. It is no exaggeration to say that the history of American art cannot be written without us. Creating the widest possible access to our collections has always been at the very heart of the archive's mission. In the 50s, and indeed through much of the remainder of the 20th century, microfilm was the high-tech way to do this. And our legacy microfilm collection is still heavily used and is available in multiple locations across the country. It can also be borrowed at no cost nationally and internationally through interlibrary loan, and it is hundreds of times a year. In 2004, however, we began building a system to accommodate fully digitized collections on our website. Today, we're leaders in the field of digitization of large-scale manuscript collections, and our guidance is regularly sought by those wishing to build digitization programs of their own. 225 fully digitized collections are available on our website and can be used in a way that closely simulates the experience researchers have when they come to our reading room, but they can have that experience at 11 o'clock at night in their pajamas if they want to. For collections that are not fully digitized but have EAD finding aids on our website, and nearly 1,000 of them currently do, users can request digitization on demand, through which they can select a folder or folders, and for a small fee, we will digitize them and deliver the digital files within 4 weeks or less. A key goal of our current strategic plan is to have 4,000 finding aids for existing collections online by 2023, while continuing to process virtually all newly acquired collections within a year of acquisition. This work is rapidly leading to more and more finding aids and more collections that are available for digitization on demand, even as we continue to fully digitize collections every day. So what are archives, and how is the content of archives evolving as we move through the 21st century? So I should say that when I talk about archives today, I'm not talking about the entire body of materials that exist in an artist's studio during his or her lifetime as a living, changing body of information and ideas, but rather the group of materials that have enduring research value and which ultimately become part of a permanent collection of the artist's papers late in or after his or her lifetime. Much material produced, acquired, or gathered by an artist will not become part of an archive, which is not to say it's not important. It's simply beyond the scope of what we or many other archives collect. So for us, the archive is a subset of that larger group of materials. And the material that can ultimately constitute our definition of an archive plays different roles at different stages of an artist's life. And it's important to acknowledge that the material need not and probably should not be treated the same way at each of these stages. I should also define what we mean when we talk about papers. For us, the generic term papers can mean personal and professional correspondence, diaries or journals, sketchbooks, loose sketches and studies, but not finished works of art, photographs, slides, film, audio, and video, not only of work, but of the subject, family, friends, and studio, lectures, addresses, and unpublished articles, scrapbooks, clippings, small exhibition catalogs that are not widely available, announcements, teaching materials, original files, financial papers, emails, floppy disks and other electronic files, and databases. That does not mean that we take all of these kinds of materials from every artist whose papers we collect, but we review these kinds of materials to see if they contain information that is likely to have enduring research value. We know how to manage all of those categories, including more recent born digital files like emails and databases. But as a field, archives are grappling with the challenge of some newer repositories of key information, including social media. And this is a challenge on which we will all have to continue to work aggressively to ensure that valuable historical information is not lost. As the nature of art continually evolves, the line between art and archives also evolves. What is relatively straightforward for a painter is less straightforward for a performance artist or an artist who engages in social practice. So our understanding of what constitutes papers also has to evolve. And the shifting nature of art today requires that we also be ever more mindful of having conversations with artists during their lifetimes to understand their definition of the difference between art and archives in their own work. It is our strong belief that artists must have agency in their own legacies, and the relationships we build with artists during their lifetimes help us ensure that we're honoring their wishes for their archives after they're gone. So I'd like to highlight one recent acquisition that provides a glimpse into some of the complexities of collecting archives today, and that's the initial gift of papers of artist and educator Roberta Cifuentes. So floppy disks may not seem new to many of you, and there are probably some of you in the audience who've never used one. But because in archival work, there is typically a lag between when something is created and when archivists begin to deal with it, floppy disks are among the newer challenges in the archival field, raising practical, technical, and ethical questions. We know how to pull data off floppy disks and put it in a format that can be preserved and migrated over time. But think about it. A couple of floppy disks might contain the same amount of information that would formerly have been held in an entire box of papers. We tend to be less vigilant about throwing away digital files than we are about papers because they're not piling up on our desk in a way that we can see them. So more recent collections contain a lot more stuff than older collections, and by way of the nature that stuff was created. On top of that, these disks contain material created in software that is largely obsolete, and it still all has to be gone through and assessed. With the Cifuentes papers, first, the artist had material on floppies in familiar, if obsolete, formats. But there were also some formats that seemed to have been custom developed for artwork that's similar to internet art. We created a bit-for-bit disk image, and we looked at these custom files on an old Mac, where we were able to read them and see them as they were intended to be seen. But one day, that old Mac and all the other old Macs will die, and we're going to have to invest in creating software that will be able to present the data in the way that it was meant to be seen far into the future. We can't do that now, but doing a bit-for-bit transfer means it will be possible in the future. Second, Cifuentes was ahead of his time in terms of computer use. He made his own archive of thousands of early emails, but he didn't use a software that's compatible with today's software. We can preserve the emails, but we have to do that in PDF format, which is much more cumbersome than a searchable digital file, but it's still a lot better than nothing. Today, emails present far less of a challenge for artists and archivists. They're ubiquitous, and there are broadly used and accepted ways of preserving them for archival purposes. Finally, as we all know, though we don't necessarily have it at top of mind every day, digital data is never really gone. When we made the data transfer from the floppy disks, we found material that Cifuentes had deleted, but the data was still there and still readable. It was material we thought he would not likely want in a public archive. So we contacted him to talk about it with him, and he did not want it in a public archive. So in conversation with him, we selectively deleted the data that he had not intended to donate to us. And this made me even more keenly aware of the new ethical challenges of dealing with born digital material and the extra vigilance that will be required as we process more and more collections with this material in them. It also made me think that in this changing time, it's more and more important to try to address these challenges with the artist while he or she is alive, or at the very least, with his or her closest confidants soon after the artist's death. And once again, our core goal is to honor the artist's intention, and ensuring that we do that is just becoming a little more involved than it once was. So the Cifuentes example is just one of many I could give you, and I know my colleagues could also share many similar examples. It's a good illustration of how, over time, the ways of communicating and capturing important parts of our lives have evolved. And certainly the digital age is bringing new challenges at a faster rate than in the past, and the amount of data being created can sometimes feel overwhelming. But I'm here to tell you, and I think my colleagues would agree, that it's going to be all right. No one is trying to tackle these challenges alone. Professional archivists across the country and the world are developing and sharing tools to meet the challenge of rapid change. And what has been so wonderful and gratifying for me working as part of a community of professional archivists is that these people are not driven by solving problems for isolated situations in their own institutions or repositories, though they certainly do that too, but by solving problems for the field. The knowledge of the new generation of archivists is astounding, and their fluency with digital tools is enabling the field to keep up with the rapid pace of change. Information created today will be preserved for the future. Thank you.
All right. So I always say to artists whenever I go and visit their studio, your trash is my treasure. A number of years ago, I acquired a tan folder, the legal size, at what could best be described as a rummage sale. On the cover of the folder, an inscription in black ink indicates that the same jacket had once held a set of black and white photographs depicting the studio of Hungarian French op artist Victor Vasarely. At some point, a diagonal line in green ink was drawn over the cover's inscription, denoting that the original materials contained within had been removed, and the folder had been recycled for another use. A new inscription was then added. Now in the top right corner of the folder, in the same green ink as the cancellation mark, A new notation simply reads, in all capital letters, Kusama. And hopefully this will play. Nope. That's unfortunate. What you're supposed to be seeing is a movie depicting the opening of the folder so you can see all the contents. Opening the folder presents the contents revealed to be a short testimonial drafted in 1964 by Sir Herbert Reed attesting to Kusama's talent, a folded tabloid-size sheet of paper of 6 reviews from various international publications penned in 1964. One review by Brian O'Doherty, published in the New York Times, is titled, "Kusama Explores a New Area. She Pursues Boredom." Also enclosed is a 1966 catalog/folder of Kusama's first one-person show held at the Gallery d'Arte in Milan. There are additionally 2 additional variants of the press releases for her show at the Castelline Gallery in March through April 1966. The press release for showing of Kusama's film Self-Obliteration at the Gate Theater in June 1967, and in Woodstock the following month, plus 2 handbills for those showings. It's really unfortunate.
I'm trying to get some to come.
The press release for her naked event outside of the stock exchange held on Wall Street, July 14th, 1968, and handbills for the 1967 Body Festival by Kusama held just up the street, or down the street, in Washington Square Park. Another flyer showing, for a showing of the self-obliteration, and the handbills for Kusama's 1968 guerrilla performance at St. Patrick's Cathedral titled Her Phallics Festival. 3 versions of a press release for her naked events at the Statue of Liberty held on July 17, 1968, and 1 more handbill for a showing of Kusama's film to be presented at the Palm Gardens on January 20th, 1968. A small text on the bottom of that flyer reads, "Naked Party, Orgy, Obliterate the Statue of Liberty, Come as you are, leave as you will be. A night is obliterate yourself, let the mind be open, time is now. Swing in the light of the infinity room, now is all your own." So also this would be a movie. The file also contains an issue of number 7 of the Japanese periodical Contemporary Art magazine, published in 1965, with a cover depicting an artwork by Kusama. Following an introductory article on Jan Duvefay, Lucio Fontana, and Yves Klein, the issue presents an extensive 12-page article on Kusama and her works, with images of the artists in the studio surrounded by those artworks. In blue ink in Kusama's hand throughout this issue are her notes and translations of snippets of the text depicted in the object's titles. This file and its contents were once the property of the notable German photographer Harry Schunk, who with his professional partner, Hungarian János Kender, documented artists and artworks extensively under the name Schunk Kender in the 1960s before their dissolving of their partnership in the early 1970s. In collaboration with the artists, they helped craft some of the most iconic artworks of the era, including Yves Klein's 1960 image, Leap into the Void, a composite photograph wedging a flying Klein into a Parisian street scene with or without, in some situations, a passing cyclist. Kusama, wanting to place herself within the lexicon of images, hired Schunk Kender to document many of her performative works in the early 1960s, including her 1968 mirror performance. And here we see Kusama painting her trademark polka dots onto one of the dancers, with both Kusama and her dancer wearing Kusama's own unique fashion designs. Kusama's mirror performances would far persuade her monumentally popular mirror installations produced over the last 30 years. Those installations with lengthy lines that zip down the street of Chelsea and elsewhere, people waiting to enter and take a selfie. Back in the late 1960s, these images were systematically placed by Kusama, not just into the art world context, but into popular culture across the spectrum. And again, there should be a movie, From High to Lowbrow, as reflected in 3 additional magazines found within the folder, including Mr., as seen here, from August 1968, which between softcore pornography incorporated a multi-page section titled Kusama and Her Naked Happenings. And issue number 1, dated 1968, of Poor Boy, a stylized beatnik take on Playboy, containing articles such as Tripping Out, the Sexational Strip-In, which is a review of activities in Thompson Square Park, the essay Flower Power on a Pillow about beatniks in Lower East Side, a rundown of the San Francisco music scene featuring the band Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, and other San Francisco musicians, and a profile of Andy Warhol and his so-called Far Out Film Factory. Finally, the folder closes out with a copy of the November 29th, 1968 inaugural issue of Screw magazine, the seminal tabloid of sleaze, which featured a centerfold arranged by Kusama, depicting her self-obliteration in Central Park. In effect, the single folder tells a very narrow narrative, not just about Kusama, but a highly truncated story about Schunkender's work, from which a full archive surrounding their activities no longer exists, thus making teasing out other rich stories in their fullest a much more difficult effort to tell. Over the years, we've all seen fragments of archives turn up in unexpected places, frequently containing little gems divorced from the creators and distanced, excised from larger timelines. I've made a living presenting some of these fragments as a curator in focused exhibitions. And one such exhibition opens today in Chelsea at the Susan Inglick Gallery, where I'm presenting a lost, now found, binder of 121 photographs of paintings by John McLaughlin, shown alongside a few of the original canvases. These paintings lend context to the black and white images, which are devoid of McLaughlin's harmonious play between color, composition, and scale. However, in turn, the photographs provide a graphic timeline reflecting the artist's production over a 20-year span. Much to my economic detriment, I counsel artists and estates not to break up their archives, but to preserve them, to entrust artistic legacies to institutions that will share their contents with the public and place their histories alongside those of others from their generation, so that richer stories can be told, enveloping parallel narratives and broader cultural connection points. Thanks.
Hello. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk a bit about recent work that I've been doing, both with the Artist Studio Archives project and also my current dissertation research. And the kind of overarching strain of all of that is helping think of ways to support artists' personal archiving practices. And so projected behind me is a painting by Cornelio Campos, a painter based in Durham, North Carolina, that I've been working with. And I'm glad that I didn't try to do a PowerPoint, because it seems like every aspect of that would have failed anyway. So you get to enjoy looking at this painting while I talk. And I'll touch a bit on the work that I've done with Cornelio a little bit later in my presentation. So the overall motivations for my work are twofold. One is to better understand artists' information needs and practices for their personal archiving. So what kinds of information do they need to support those kinds of activities? What resources do they need to support those kinds of activities? And where are they seeking that information out? Is this websites, books, other artists, other colleagues, other peers? So kind of generally, what are those information needs and what are those information sources that support this work? And then the second motivation is, with this greater understanding of artists' information needs and practices, how can cultural heritage institutions, libraries, archives, and museums cultivate communities to support that kind of work, to provide the information for artists to do that kind of work? So my research in this area is still ongoing. I still have to finish my dissertation, but overall, I can say that while the personal and studio archiving fulfills a really important need in artists' professional work and in their ongoing artistic legacy, which we're all aware of and we'll be talking about throughout the day today. So despite the importance of this, artists continually lament that they are lacking those professional skills or are needing to find those professional skills in kind of ad hoc and informal ways. So many of the artists lament that they have not received this training, for instance, in their MFA programs or through other educational programs they've been a part of, right? So they're finding that they graduate, that they're partway through their career and recognizing that they're lacking these really critical skills to support their archiving practices. So overall, I want to talk about how collecting and preserving artist archival materials is necessarily a cooperative activity. So this is a term that I'm borrowing from Howard Becker in his sociological study of art worlds. So Becker talks about how art worlds are constituted by cooperative activity, right? It's not just the artist creating the work, but it's the art handlers moving work in and out of galleries, it's curators selecting how work is displayed, it's art critics and art historians writing about the context of that work, and it's audiences going to view that work and experience that work, right? So art worlds as a sociological concept are constituted by all this cooperative activity, all of these individuals working together, drawing on a range of technologies, practices, and different things to support art worlds. So while Becker talks about that in the context of artworks, I want to argue that the same can be true of artist archival materials as well, right? So artist archives are maintained and created through, even though they seem like they are in kind of solo activities, right? The artist kind of accumulating things in closets or on hard drives. We can see that the ongoing maintenance and support of these archival materials requires cooperative activity. It's not just the artist's responsibility. Artists are drawing on a range of information and resources. The care of this stuff requires a range of skills and techniques, and really importantly, many different kinds of resources, technology, financial resources, and time, importantly. So building and sustaining personal studio archives require what I want to call infrastructures of care. All these things working together to support artist archival materials. And these infrastructures of care can be seen to be constituted by skills and techniques, so how to archive things, how to preserve things, knowledge and information, so knowledge about the context of the materials or knowledge about how to use certain technologies or certain practices, and then resources and technologies. So for example, an artist wanting to construct a catalog or database of their artworks, so when artworks were created, where they were exhibited, if they were sold or not, who they're collected by, that kind of activity would require a range of things. It would require database software to do this. It would require skills for using that software, knowledge of what metadata would be useful to collect, and then the time and energy to keep up that database over time. So this is just one example, and we could think of many other examples that would require similar kinds of infrastructures of care, archiving social media, maintaining a personal web page, creating documentation of artworks, organizing analog or digital files, right? All of those things require skills, knowledge, and technology and resources. So cultural heritage organizations build these infrastructures of care to preserve the materials in their collections, right? They hire staff, they acquire hardware and software, they devote physical and virtual space for these collections. And similarly, artists need to build and sustain similar infrastructures of care for their personal archives, but without the resources of a major institution. So outside of these institutional contexts, artist personal archiving may seem like solo activities. It may seem like it's the artist alone doing this work, but this is still necessarily cooperative work. And I want to talk about how cultural heritage organizations can make this cooperative work less hard-won by the artists themselves and can support this cooperative activity in partnership and in collaboration with artists. So archiving, as I've been talking about, is necessarily a cooperative activity, and as a result of that, the artist community is a really strong determinant of how this kind of infrastructure of care gets built and developed. So, for instance, an artist working in New York would have access to many different kinds of information, knowledge, and resources than the artists that I've been working with in North Carolina, for instance. So I want to think about then how information professionals can cultivate this kind of cooperative activity to support and advance the infrastructures of care that artists need for personal archiving, especially outside of major cultural hubs. So how can information professionals serve artists working in rural areas or basically any area outside of New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles? And so one example of that is the work that I've been doing as part of the Artist Studio Archives project at University of North Carolina. So that started as an IMLS funded project that ran from 2015 to 2017, and since then the project team has continued the work initiated by that project in other ways. So the overall goals of the Artist Studio Archives project was to develop educational resources for artists to support them in their archiving practices. So this took the form of offering training through free skill building workshops open to all North Carolina artists, the creation of information resources that were made available online through our website, and then providing access to resources through community partnerships. So providing access to hardware and software, but also things like archival boxes, digitization equipment, and things like that. So there are kind of two main strains of the project. One was the skill building workshops that I mentioned, and this helped artists to develop skills for both analog and digital materials while making connections between artists and information professionals in their local communities. And then the other kind of main strain of this project were one-on-one internships with North Carolina artists. So I worked with Cornelio Campos, the artist of this work, projected up here. And in that project, I helped to facilitate a partnership between Cornelio and the North Carolina archives in the Durham County Library, so the local library in the community in which he worked. So as a result of that collaborative project, Cornelio worked with the archivist at this library to help him to organize his materials and to give him a repository for non-active materials, so things that he wasn't currently using but still wanted to keep as part of his archives. So they provided archival storage space and archival materials for that. And throughout this, he was actively involved in appraisal, description, and determining how access would be provided to these materials. So he still maintains custody of these materials while also helping to make them accessible to the broader community. So I want to go over three kind of major takeaways from this work with the Artist Studio Archives project, and kind of thinking forward how this work will continue to evolve. So the first major takeaway is that information professionals need to work in and through artist communities. So not imposing these services for supporting artist personal archiving activities as imperatives or best practices, or the kind of information professional coming in and telling the artist how they should be archiving their stuff. Instead, I think we need to take a kind of collaborative and community building approach by working through the artist communities themselves and looking for spaces to facilitate collaboration and community building. So for instance, working through local public libraries that are already integral to the artist communities, and that would have a lower barrier to entry than, for instance, Duke University, which is also in Durham. No, not throwing shade on Duke. They do good stuff too. So the second major takeaway is that there's a huge benefit to these kinds of efforts. So with both the skill building workshops and the work that I've done with Cornelio, it's just been really amazing to witness the value that the artists get out of taking part in these partnerships. So it helps to accomplish all these things that we've been talking about supporting artist personal archiving practices, helping them to have archives that can fulfill all of the great professional activities that artists are carrying out, like keeping track of their materials, keeping track of where works are bought and sold, helping them to have materials ready to apply for grants or exhibitions. So it fulfills all these professional needs, but it also fulfills this kind of overall, it helps artists to see the value of their materials in this kind of more overarching sense, that their archival materials have value to their artistic legacy and also have value to the communities in which they work, contributing to the cultural heritage of their local arts communities. So Cornelio, for instance, was really just very moved by having his materials in the local public library, and really felt that by kind of having his material stored there and accessible to the community there, that he was really integrated into the community and part of the community's history. And the third major takeaway is that the development of these kinds of services needs to be informed by empirical research. So we should be developing these services with an empirical understanding of what artists' information needs and practices already are. So what are the things that artists are already doing? What are the skills, technologies, and information that they still need access to or actually want help with, and develop services and resources that meet the empirically driven understanding of what artists' information needs are. And so to conclude, sum up, so even though artist archival materials are often hidden, accumulating in virtual and physical spaces, they need to be actively maintained, requiring a range of skills, information, and resources, this infrastructure of care that I've been talking about. And though they're frequently invisible and this activity often seems like a solo activity, artist studio archiving is a cooperative activity, and we need to be treating it as a cooperative activity and developing communities to foster that cooperative activity. So recognizing and understanding this, information professionals, the role that they can play is to consider how they can support this cooperative activity, how they can make it less a hard-won cooperation by the artists themselves and something that's more readily accessible as part of their local arts communities. So how to foster a shared infrastructure of care that supports artist archiving. Thank you. Thank you.
This morning with Kate and Colin to sort of give you, first of all, Kate can't take everything at Archives of American Art. And Colin has aptly pointed out that really there needs to be sort of a groundswell of support for archives. So I think all of you in the room are very aware that, 1960 on, there's just been an extraordinary increase in this material. And Colin articulated, I thought, very well the notion that artists not only need to take care of their own archive, but need to be consciously aware of how important that is for their community and the context in which they work, that it is a struggle for an artist to take on the stewardship of their archive. They want to make art. They don't want to take care of their archive. And yet, and it's my personal belief that artists basically do everything always, but they have to do all the lion's share. The lion's share of the work is always done by the artists, but that the artists also need to take the time to invest in the values that they've generated, whether that's in their local community in North Carolina or whether it's here in New York. I think that's a really complicated question, right? But that in fact, there's a breadth of material out there, and that the support of it all can't come from like 4 institutions across the country or from and yet adding in another 5 institutions in New York, but in fact that there has to be localized support of very specific communities, as Colin aptly said. And Marvin just walked in, and Marvin, as I think you all pretty much know, that Marvin did that at Fails, that he really defined a very tight community. And so that the artists, writers, poets, musicians, dancers, could rally around a time period in the history in New York that was so important to them and was such a generator of very specific values, and that has to happen broadly across the archive world. Let me see. My first question, Kate. I was really intrigued. How long have you been at Archives of American Art? 6 years. And you've initiated a lot of new programs to sort of address what is not an excessive amount of funding to support the work that you do. And you've been creative. And I would say, what are some of the things that have been most transformative for you in this tenure that you feel have been useful? I still think you have boxes and boxes of things you can't get to.
We do. I'm just thinking it'd be easier to pass this around this way. I haven't really created new programs in terms of how we're dealing with the material that we bring in, but I have worked really hard to build reliable, permanent support for those programs. You know, any of us who work in nonprofits, well, all of us in our lives know that the need to just continually keep going out and finding that money is exhausting and can limit your ability to do what you want to do with the material you have. So we have created a couple of endowments. We now have an $11 million endowment that supports processing and digitization. $5 million of that is dedicated to papers on or of or about women and artists from historically underrepresented groups. So we're really proud of that, sort of expanding the narrative around American art. But it's you know, I listen to you, Colin, and I agree with you. I think it's so important, and community-based organizations are probably the ones to do the kind of work that you're describing, because national organizations are working hard to keep up with what we're already doing. But I also, if I could, just pick up on something that you said, Colin. So the Cornelio Campos archive, the library that was helping him and providing storage for the inactive material, will they ultimately accession the entire archive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is that this is an ongoing relationship. So part of the benefit of starting this relationship early on in his career, and he's kind of like in the middle of his career right now, is that these things that we've been talking about, like things being kind of lost because they weren't able to be preserved because the artist didn't think that they were worthwhile or didn't have the time or energy to maintain it, or space that would have gotten thrown away, now has a place to go, right? So I think there's, especially with digital materials, this is especially important to start these relationships early on, which is what you talked about as well, right? That without that kind of early intervention or early kind of activity to help care for those materials, a lot of that stuff can get lost or just kind of rendered obsolete. So yeah, part of the idea behind that was starting this kind of ongoing relationship, and they have kind of a deed of gift, but it's kind of like open-ended, right? So it's kind of like Cornelia will continue to kind of accession things there as they become kind of inactive, and he doesn't want to keep them in his house. But it's the idea that at the end of his career, that kind of all of his stuff will go there.
Just one more comment to add to that is I think one of the reasons this community activity is so important is that for us, you know, I think people think, well, I want to be in the archives of American art because I'm an American artist. But sometimes if an artist's primary world and influence has been in his or her own community, they're going to get lost in the archives of American art. And really the better place for them is in a community-based archive where the other artists who were working around them may also be. And as you were saying, David, to sort of live in conversation with these other collections that bring more meaning to a single collection.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think technology creates the opportunity for some interesting partnerships there. So an institution like yours or that library could be the primary holder of that archive, but say if Archives of American Art felt that you have to have material, but that you could link on the web to an archive so that there could be a supplement to a historical story based on, I mean, a good example would be the artist working around Black Mountain. So there could really easily be a web link through Bob Rauschenberg back to Black Mountain and to that local archive there. and that those kinds of partnerships, I think, are on the horizon more and more. I know some people are doing. I don't know if you've done that at all with.
Well, that's the kind of thing that linked open data is trying to do, and so the entire field is working toward linked open data. That, for example, if you were looking for Black Mountain College, you would find those people everywhere that they are much more easily than you can now. So that is one of those field-wide initiatives that none of us could possibly accomplish on our own, though we contribute very actively to that effort.
And I want to say too that I do think there's great potential in linked open data, but I think it's imperative that it's something that the cultural heritage profession does and not leaving it up to Google or schema.org to do, because we need to be the ones that are determining how we're describing these materials, how we're linking these materials, because otherwise things are going to get butchered.
Also, too, I think it's not major institutions or libraries who need to do the linking. I mean, foundations can be linking, and artists can be linking also. So there's the potential for sharing. David, you've worn so many hats in the art world, and you've been on both sides of the fence in terms of engaging people who otherwise didn't know yet the value of archival material, to utilizing heavily as an educational tool in a large institution. You've just switched back to being very more directly involved. And what do you see as the changes that's happened in terms of the management of archival material as it relates to your work right now from before?
So I love the word value. Value has these two plays. One is the historic value of the material at hand. The second is the economic value. I relish the duality and relish the fact that I can make a living playing with this material on both ends of the spectrum. Institutionally, it's complicated when you are working in a very large place and you want to tell a large story, but the materials fall within multiple departments. I'm looking at you, my colleague, Michelle. MoMA has essentially 7 departments: prints and illustrated books, or now drawings and prints, excuse me, painting and sculpture, film, media performance, architecture and design, and the library. They're all very separate fiefdoms. They all have their own separate budget lines. They all have their separate collecting permutations. If one artist is not favored by another department, that artist's portion of that body of work won't be collected. That is to say, if you are an artist that works in painting, sculpture, drawings, media performance, film, and 2 of those departments like you and the other 4 do not, your body is going to be broken up and you're no longer going to be a holistic human being. The beauty of an archive is being able to tell a very discrete narrative story and pull these things together even when you can't possibly pull the object that you want to pull in through a collection exhibition, which is to say that we can tease out narratives in unique ways by playing with the archival material to tell this story. And again, just to rephrase that, I've got a show that opens today about John McLaughlin. It's 121 black and white photographs that I found in a binder in an archive that was destroyed. I mean, there was no reason for this John McLaughlin binder to be there. And the binder documents paintings from roughly 1947 to roughly 1968. They're inconsistent, meaning that it's not a catalog raisonné, but it's incredibly complete to this artist. And so the show is about 120 of those photographs individually framed in a timeline with 3 paintings interspersed, one from 1947, one from about 1956, and one from 1965, so that within this timeline you get a sense of all the punctuation points that are within it. And that's sort of the beauty of being able to play with an archive. And I think the point of what my broader opening monologue was to say that there are 2 possible ways of looking at what happened to the Shunkender archive. One is that Shunkender were everywhere. They documented everything. They were artists in their own right. They facilitated many artists' dreams. And although the photographs are largely, at least the Schunk element of it is largely part of many collections now because the Liechtenstein the foundation collected them because they were thrown in a dumpster outside of the Westbeth building after Kenter died, or Schunk died rather. So you can tell one portion of that story, but you can't tell the other intersections. And then the Kusama end, Kusama begins her work in the late 1950s, and this one file, which is about 36 elements, only tells the story about the performative activities from roughly 1965 to 1968. And so it's part of this very narrow, tight story. So the relishing beauty of what I like to do is sort of tease out these stories and tell them, but acknowledging full on that these are very truncated stories. And there's other ways to tell them. And I hope someone else can take up the mantle and do that.
So I think that the notion of the value for an artist is, I think, something that artists need to think about. What is the value of their archive for them? As the archives are transitioned, or they hope they're transitioned to an institution, someone, or maybe two people mentioned that, do artists know that they won't have access to that material any longer? Or can they negotiate for that up front? In terms of value, whether an archive or material is sold, do the artist and the collector who buys it know that it has this potential other value, and can make choices based on that? I think artists being equipped to understand, again, and we'll get into this in a later session today, is that archival material has a very distinct value when it's in an archive, and it's a wonderful value, but it can't serve in the ways that it did before. You can't, I had an artist approach me who had deposited their paper somewhere, and they wanted to continue with the idea based on a drawing that had been placed in this archive, and they weren't allowed to get it back. They couldn't get that back. Now, maybe they could negotiate that. I don't know if that complicated. Those kind of negotiations can happen in contracts, but those are the kinds of thinking that an artist needs to know about. Or if they want their archive to go to a safe haven, that's one thing. But then also, too, in terms of what they negotiate, or some of the exciting thing that Kate is working towards, is that their archive can be processed within a year so that it is made publicly available, that it is digitally accessible. How indexed is that? You know, if you deposit 10 boxes somewhere and it only says, you know, Jane Doe 1 through 10, and that's what's put online to talk about your archive, it may not do what you were hoping it would do, even though it's somewhere safe forever. And so enabling artists to ask some of these questions is, I think, what the work Colin is asking back. And I think it's in the work that David's doing, is to say, you have the privilege of owning this, but do know that it's linked to these other stories, and that long term, you might want to consider where it goes, or who gets it next, or how you share it. Collectors being committed to sharing archival material as a public resource, as a research tool, letting researchers come and look at it. Those are some of the conversations that I think are really interesting now that worlds are colliding. I was curious to know if you two have ever worked together. Yeah. That's just shocking to me. Yes. I think in this period now specifically is this rise of living artists. Actually, you mentioned Richard Tuttle's name, and I know Richard and his delight at his archive, going to Archives American Art, within a context that's very suitable, within dealers that he worked with before and friends whose archives are there. But as Colin says, even within New York, we have to define the communities that can come around material. And one of our panelists later today, Rodney Sir, has been working very hard for a community he's been committed to. And so rallying the art world to not just embrace the archives of the artists who are already famous, but to really say, actually, their archive is not going to be very well understood if we don't commit to the context that they worked in and the values they worked against and with. And I think your presentation, David, spoke to that, you know, really considering the richness of Kusama's engagement in various communities throughout her life was transformative in her work, and that the archival material tells that story. It tells the story of what she turned to and what she turned away from within herself and within the relationships she had. So that's all very important. Do you all have any questions for each other further? No? Shall we open it up to the floor for you to ask questions of our panelists here?
I'm interested to know if you know who took the photographs in the Susan Inglet show of the McLaughlin North.
No. The binder is pretty mysterious. There are the 8x10s are glued down for the most part to 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, and there's pencil or ink notations about the size, dimension, the artist's name. About 1958, they become numbered and dated. And on the back of many of the photographs is a Felix Landau gallery rubber stamp. But that's the only information it provides. Oh, and a top and a bottom, because otherwise you would never know which is top and bottom.
Hi. So Jennifer, when you started, you mentioned the monetization of the archive, and you made a point that that wasn't in a negative sense. And David, you said that also sometimes you would suggest against your own financial interest to keep archives together. And I just wondered how you could talk a little bit further about this issue of private collection versus institutional collection, because often the priorities are so different. I mean, I just wonder if you could have a conversation with each other.
I'll let you
regarding
go
that.
first, David. I think there are negative parts to it and positive parts.
So in the case of a full archive, I would never want to see that broken up unless they're duplicate materials. And that would allow someone to break that out and sell it individually. But whenever possible, an archive should be someplace among like objects. It should be open to public access. It should be something that could be studied with broader stories to be able to be told. In the case of that Kusama file, it doesn't belong in an archive. And it probably deserves to be together because it tells one specific story, but it's surrogated all over the place. And I don't think there's anything unique within it that would warrant that it ends up in Archives of American Art, for example.
Well, this is could be a whole panel itself. I think that one of the things that's sort of tragic is that institutions are paying money now for archives and not investing in processing. So and as a curator, former curator, modern in an institution, archives are now being treated like institutional assets. And so it's appealing to a governing board to have an endowment to acquire something, but they're not committing to caring for it, processing it, making it accessible. There's not enough seats in the reading room. There's not enough digitization going on or the consideration of digitization on demand. So, and most artists don't know that. So not even a famous artist can be offered a modest sum for their archive, which seems very appealing in the moment. But I think most artists say with, I'm making this figure up, they're offered $20,000 for their archive or $10,000. And that seems like a great thing. But in fact, investing that money in the care of the archive once it is deposited would be if an artist knew what those terms meant, they might choose that instead of getting that monetary gift to themselves. Another thing is that in the art world now, and I think this is such an interesting and compelling notion, is that there are significant archives going into institutions. The money isn't there to process them yet. There's not a one-year commitment. But the art world has the money, easily could be given on behalf of an artist that many collectors or their dealer loves. The money is nominal in many cases to actually process that archive. But once it goes to a major institution, whether, I'll just name institutions here, whether it goes to Cade or Yale or NYU, no one is going to give that money. It's very unlikely that they would give the money to store that archive. And so that conversation needs to be happening in the art world now, because easily you can have a cocktail party that could raise the money to help process an artist's archive and make it publicly accessible. But I don't think anyone, or very few people, are thinking that way.
I don't agree entirely. I think processing independently as one-offs, and processing is not digitization, and what digitization requires is a big infrastructure to make a collection available in a way that anybody can really use it in a meaningful way doesn't belong in a one-off context. So if the idea is to make sure that a collection is accessible, processed, digitized, why wouldn't if that is important to a collector, for example, why wouldn't that collector say, I know you want your archive at X place, and I'm going to give the money to make sure it's accessible there? I think I was misunderstanding you, because you said once it went into an institution, it wouldn't happen.
But it would be difficult to get that collector to support the institution, so we're agreeing.
Okay.
That conversation should happen up front, and then it's a win-win for everybody.
But are you saying it should be processed before it goes to the institution? Okay, sorry, I just misunderstood you.
I mean, that's always exciting for institution, but it wouldn't bring that work necessarily to the institution standard, so it would be a little bit risky and complicated.
I many collectors tell me it's not sexy to pay for processing.
No.
So there's just a shift that needs to take place. Sometimes. Yeah, but so that we somehow have to encourage them to think in that way about philanthropy, because it's much more exciting to buy work.
Well, and also too, I mean, even a collector's perspective, I'm going to make a generalization here, and it's not true across the board, but generally, there was a larger swath of collectors 40 years ago, 30 years ago, who were collecting mindfully for the public good. And they were some, and you still work with some collectors who are like that, who are amassing a collection that has an intrinsic focus, mission, value, and they're preparing to deposit that as a public asset. But a lot of collectors, and you don't even have to get down to archive material now, actually, I sit at far more dinners where people say, with artwork, not even with an archive, I'm hoping you can tell me how to protect my assets for my children. I don't want to lend this material anymore. That's a risk, and it is a risk to lend anything. I won't, but that in fact, the stewardship of a remarkable object, archival object or archive or artwork is a public stewardship. And that the conversation about being committed to caring for and lending or making accessible for research is one that all of us should always be having with anyone who's passionate about art. It's the idea of saying, you know, you don't have to protect this from the big, bad, terrible world. You need to make judicious decisions about letting other people who care as much as you do make either the content that's here accessible, the images accessible, the actual work for study accessible. And that's the same with archives. And so that's where I say it's an interesting proposition to cultivate a field of archive stewards who actually are thinking that way, and whether it's an individual object or a whole archive.
I have a question that sort of follows up on that, related to ethical dimensions of the archive, especially in the case where we're working with an archive of living figures. For example, the archive I work with, the Hans Ulrich Albert's Curatorial Archive, we have a strict rule. No lists of names of artists who are being considered for exhibitions and things like that should get out. So my question for you is, how do you deal with information embargoes and things like that? What limits to the archive could be considered ethical limits?
I feel like I'm talking a lot. It's a great and important question. And for us, those limits would be set by the donor only. We do not set those limits ourselves. We don't think that is our role. But if a donor wants to set limits, we respect those limits. We wouldn't say something could be restricted for, 1,000 years, but it could be for a long period of time until the sensitive issues were less fraught.
Yeah. So time frames is one way to manage that. Time frames on certain lots of material. Again, technology makes it possible to store data at various levels so that there's not access that's the same across the board. You have a front page, you have a back page, you have a sub back page. So that's a helpful way to manage this.
And I'll add to the benefit, another benefit of building these community partnerships early on is that those conversations can be happening early on before things are being accessioned or gifted or however the case may be to an archive, right? So the artist is able to start thinking about those things and also building up an awareness of what it means to archive something. Yeah, will everything be made accessible? Will certain things be restricted? And so those kinds of considerations can start to be discussed earlier on rather than waiting to the point when things are being transferred to an archive.
Thank you. I wanted to ask for comments from the panelists and returning a little bit about the role that the marketplace, but also what Colin mentioned in terms of the giant technology companies that may be overtaking the management of digital assets. Just because I'm originally from Mexico, so I come from a country where the government has a big role in cultural preservation, and that's not the case in the United States. And now I feel that the route of both private collections for private collectors that want to have their own private museums, along with artist endowed foundations, are really the tools that are growing legacy preservation platforms. Whereas I feel strongly, like the Smithsonian, for example, plays an important role that actually democratizes access. And private foundations may aim to do that, but it's a much more bumpy road, to say the least. I think we have yet to see. And that's not accounting for the access to the infrastructure that companies like Google are already aiming for in terms of cultural dominance. So incorporating market needs as a way of funding archival preservation programs, I think complicates the panorama for me. So I wonder if maybe, I don't know if any of you can speak to it, but I would be interested to hear how you envision this challenge in terms of where the money is and the power is, the needs are, and then the cultural benefit for society at large may be at odds with these.
And I'll just add too that in terms of active archival materials right now, a lot of artists, I would probably, I don't know exact figure, but many artists are storing their materials on Google Drive or Dropbox. So in terms of just like where the data is now, it's with these in this large scale corporate technological infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be very careful where you're taking your money and what the expectations are that go along with that. And we are very careful. And if someone had, as you say, you know, the Smithsonian and the Archives of American Art are about the democratization of access. And we place no limits on materials that come to us. There are often third-party copyright holders, and we respect that and direct people to those people, but we don't place any limits ourselves or put any fees on how somebody can use any of the material that's in our collection. So you do have to be very careful about where that money is coming from. And I agree with you, Colin, that the problem can't be solved by the Googles. The problem has to be solved by the field. It's going to be slower that way, but I think the end product will be better.
I think also just an open conversation about what's at stake across the field is just one way that there's a little bit more accountability and people can consider that they're making a certain choice. Like I think, I'm not sure, correct me if you all think I'm wrong, is that every artist, when they put all of their information on Google, understand that that's a risky proposition. I think a lot of people don't even know that. They think it's a very comfortable, great solution and don't have any idea what other options might be there or not. And so I think that's, and you know, how much does it cost to have another option? How is the field nurturing different options in the long term? I think that that's really, it is problematic right now, right? Who's investing in technology on the art side to really, you know, there are individuals who have sort of taking the charge on different aspects of supporting the field, but it's a really complicated concern, right?
This is a question for Kate. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you'd mentioned earlier about deciding what properly is inside the archive, what constitutes the archive, and what ends up outside of it, because it obviously can't be everything. But I guess I ask this as a writer to a degree, and thinking about writing about artists who are no longer around, and there are things that end up being very telling that probably were saved completely through happenstance. They wouldn't have been considered important during an artist's lifetime, but they end up later on becoming very telling. And so maybe if you just talk a little bit more about that process of figuring out where you draw the lines.
The lines are not clear. We're actually trying to get better at that by looking at data on how our collections have been used in the past to understand what kinds of materials have been most useful for researchers over years. We're going to make mistakes, but my colleague Liza Kerwin and I were visiting someone the other day who said that the artist whose estate she manages saved all of his junk mail. That's probably not useful for research. Sometimes someone will think it really is, and we have to say we just can't take it. So we do look for materials that we believe contain information. Here's an example. If a lesser known artist kept all of her calendars for the last 30 years, and it had all the appointments when she went to the doctor or got her car fixed, that's probably not going to be of high research value in the future. If a artist who was part of a very active community of artists kept his calendars for 30 years, and all of the people he met with over that time and all the events that he went to and the places that he traveled, that could potentially be very useful for research, even though we don't know what we're going to learn from it right now. So it is a subjective judgment, and we definitely make mistakes in both directions, in terms of not saving something that we probably should have, and in terms of saving things that we probably shouldn't. So I wish I had a better answer for that.
I've got a follow-up question for that. So in your talk, you mentioned how with digital materials, there's so much more that you have to go through than with like just a box of papers or things like that. So are you currently employing or exploring automated ways to conduct digital appraisal? And if so, what does that look like? Or what does digital appraisal look like in general for you?
Well, I am going to have to give a really general answer because I'm not an expert on this, but we do employ an expert on this, and both our archivist team and our collecting team are part of a Born Digital working group, so that they're learning to better understand the particular challenges associated with collecting and preserving this material. Our fairly new digital asset manager was the one who figured out, how we needed to deal with that Cifuentes material I mentioned. And 10 years ago, I'm not sure we would have been able to handle that as effectively as we can now.
I have a good example to follow up on the kinds of decisions that are made. When we were working on the David Wojnarowicz knowledge base, we were trying to determine what materials he used. And it turns out that we had kept all of his receipts. And we discovered the blue paint that he used. There's a very distinctive blue paint because he bought it at the store that was near his loft, right? And so had we not, then there's the things you wouldn't normally keep, you just throw them out, but it became really, really important in terms of restoration to talk about what kinds of paints did he use. So I think artists' archives just constantly complicate the way we think about processing and what we appraise and what we bring into the collection.
But you might not necessarily digitize all the receipts, but you would keep them.
Yeah, no,
Right.
I don't believe
So-
in digitization of everything. It's never going to happen.
No,
It's
right.
just, there's just too much crap.
No. Exactly, right.
But in this particular instance, it was really important that we had the.
So, as a trained artist, a trained archivist, and a museum professional, one of the things I've thought about over the years is that when I went to art school, there was no talk about how to not only preserve my own assets for my own work as I was doing, video and performance. And I don't know if that's changed, but a lot of art that is produced comes from artists that are trained at institutions, and so I think that that's another place to look at percolating information, and having it spread outwards,
I don't know if is there anyone else in the room who knows that's working in art school right now that knows. One of our advisory board members is teaching in California and is a very strong advocate in saying none of their students really know anything about how to do this, and how can we get a program to them so that they can start thinking about it in a constructive way. And I think the Born Digital question makes that even more of a driver. It's like a challenge.
Yeah, so I don't think it's happening in any comprehensive way. So in a lot of the research that I'm doing right now, I'm talking to artists from a range from early on in their career, artists that are still at MFA programs, to artists that are 75 years old. And I think with the artists that are working now, early on in their career, they're recognizing that they're not receiving these professional skills in their formal arts education. And one really great anecdote of that from my current research is that there's an artist that I was working with who's currently in an MFA program, and he was recounting to me that he was having this conversation with other students in the MFA program that they don't know how to document their work, that they're not being taught how to take good photographs of their work, both digital, interactive performance stuff, but also just sculptures and paintings and things like that. That they're not receiving those skills, and it's more important now than ever because the way that most people are going to experience work that's being produced now is through a JPEG online, right? So if you don't have a good image of your work, he said to me, like, if the work is captured in a shitty JPEG, the work is going to exist as a shitty JPEG forever, right? So no matter if the work itself is brilliant in person, most people are going to be experiencing that through this image. And at least in his context and in many other contexts that I've talked with artists about, they're not getting that training for that kind of the skills.
This discussion was just reminding me, Carolee Schneemann in many of the articles that have been kind of going over her career and contribution. There was a conversation that she was having with someone before she died. It was published, I think, just in the middle of last week, where she talked about how her gallery, which is not to cast aspersions on her gallery at all, but that her gallery was really concerned with the artwork, but really left the archive to her, for her to manage. And that she felt it, my understanding from her comments was that she felt it to be, more work than she can possibly take on. And so I'm wondering, is there a way to bring in the commercial gallery? And I don't know if there's anyone here from commercial galleries, but if there's a way to bring the commercial gallery into this discussion, because in addition to the work itself, I think that the papers are such a vital aspect, especially with artists like Carolee, whose work was in so many different disciplines. And as you were saying, many museums, have these separate divisions. It is the archive that can bring it all together.
Some galleries are very aggressive about assisting their artists in their archives, and particularly mid to late career artists, knowing that these galleries are going to become the legacy galleries theoretically for the estate. I've talked to many galleries as an intermediary with an artist to try to mitigate the distance, which is to say, to give the artist some constructive ideas about how they could go about facilitating just the basic care of their materials in aid of the gallery, because the gallery often financially just simply can't take it on. When work is selling for high six figures, if not seven, it's galleries really should take the responsibility to deal with it. If the work is in the 5 figures, it's increasingly difficult. Just to go back 1 second, with young artists, and I'm doing some teaching currently. There's so many things that artists aren't taught in school, and I think probably a bigger problem is just simply financial management. So many artists just don't know how to balance a checkbook, if not use Quicken. And I think that's sort of, being an artist is a small business. And that's the skill that I think is the primary one that schools are missing and aren't pushing students towards.
One of the challenges there is I think the art market is, dealers are interested in some of them in managing archives, but the definition of what an archive is in the commercial art world context is not the same necessarily as it is for a long-term legacy plan. And then there's, of course, the interesting middle position is estates and foundations, which are the 6 figures. They need their archive to do their work. They're interested in doing that work. Some of them have archivists working for them. It's hard for them to get to that work because the archivist in a gallery or in a lot of other settings is just a question answerer. They are like challenged to get that museum whatever information they need, get that report or whatever they need. And there is not such an understanding of what processing an archive is, organizing it so that it has communication capacities long-term, should it ever go into an institution. It's a very new world. The Liechtenstein Foundation is one of the first big estates to go out. They needed to have that archive in hand to do all the work that they needed to do for Roy's oeuvre, and then also in terms of art history, they've been very thoughtful about it. And then they also have put in place a vision for his legacy, because they themselves are going to be a perpetual institution. Kate, you can correct me here. Their partnership with the Archives of American Art by depositing the archive there and funding some aspect of it residing with you is like a fabulous model for what an estate or foundation or an individual artist who has capacity can do. Artists who are at a more modest level, again, there needs to be more clarity about what we're talking about in terms of an archive, like what's being utilized and what's being done to manage materials on the gallery side versus what happens on an institutional and archiving side. So the idea is, like, actually there are a number of dealers represented in this room, and there are a lot of archivists in the room, and I hope they all meet each other over lunch.
Quick response to David's comment about putting stuff in boxes. One thing that's interesting now is that the material nature of the archive for young artists is different now than it was 20 years ago. So much is digital. So what I do at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I teach, I tell students, put a folder on your desktop called shoebox. Throw everything in the shoebox every year, everything. Then have another folder called garage. Put the shoeboxes in the garage.
I wanted to say about the last 2 questions that I think some of the artist endowed foundations in the U.S. are trying to tackle these problems. I'm thinking of the Joan Mitchell Foundation Call project, which pairs older artists who need help with their legacy with younger artists. And so both are learning about processing, digitization, and the whole dialogue. In terms of galleries, I also think that artists, it's not easy, but can have the conversation with their dealers and galleries and talk about how the material relates to the art. And if they think it's appropriate, talk about inclusion in exhibitions, in publications of those archival materials, and begin to expand the conversation and teach the galleries about the interest, and not only how interested history will be, but there's an energy that can be created for their collectors as well.
We also should be collecting gallery archives, in case anyone knows. So if you're a researcher these days and you're researching anyone from like 1960 to the present, A lot of the research I do is all based in gallery archives. That's where the info is.
So I just wanted to share a little bit of my experience as first an art student in my undergrad experience, and then doing an MFA, and then moving on to uh, library school. When I was in undergrad, they required you as your senior presentation to document all your work. So you didn't show any of your work physically, you had to show documentation of it. So they kind of walked you a little bit through that process. And granted, this is like years ago and things were still on slides. But when I went to do my MFA, I was really surprised that there was nothing in place to talk about your work and access of it moving forward. But I recently found out that where I did my MFA, the librarians at that school has started an initiative to create a repository for student work, and the librarians there were working with students to talk about documentation, and not so much in terms of like your archive and every little bit of ephemera and writing, but more so in terms of the, creating a visual documentation profile for your work, and a little bit of the writing supporting that. So, I mean, reaching across the aisle to our librarian friends, I feel like they have a really great role for working with students to kind of planting those seeds really early, so that moving forward, people are a little bit more aware of what it means to actually create a lasting sort of impression of your work. That's all.
One last question. Two, sorry.
I'm curious to sort of circle back to Colin's comment about the shitty JPEG, and also the conversation around sort of galleries and artists and their archives, because I think there's one other element here, which is some of the nonprofits that are collecting information. I work for an artist, and we've recently run into a situation where we discovered that Art Store had acquired a large quantity of photographs that had been taken over 30 or 40 years by an individual going into galleries. So it's a wonderful record of a long span of time of New York City's gallery shows. But when those pictures were sold to Art Store, we then found out about it, and I asked on the behalf of the person I work for, we'd like to see those pictures. And I felt like it was probably the first artist representative who had ever talked to Art Store. They had no idea how to handle it. They couldn't figure out how to give me access to the information. They couldn't figure out how to link the photographs to the documentation. It took weeks. And when we finally did get it, many, many pictures are upside down, back to front, or the proverbial shitty JPEG. And we're now in a dialogue with them to see, will they fix those pictures? Will they eliminate the ones we think are really bad? It's an ongoing discussion, but it's another area where nonprofits are now in, the business, that's what it is, of doing this sort of thing too.
I think one kind of one aspect of that is these kind of different technology companies and technology services that we've been talking about in different ways. One thing that I think is really important is to think about advocating for artists and artists' archives initiatives as user groups of those technologies, because often the needs of those user groups diverge dramatically from what the services are intended to provide, or the user groups that the services are designed for, right? So Art Store is like for art libraries and things like that, but it should be, it's great that they could serve this role for artist archives or for foundations representing artist archives, but how do we advocate for that user group to help develop those services in ways that meet those needs?
Julie Martin has the last question.
I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about, you talked about community-based archival. Just talk a little bit more about that. It seems very promising, and your experience.
I mean, I'm happy to talk after the session too in more detail, but I think part of the motivation behind it is, especially for artists that are working outside of like major cultural hubs, how do we, because a lot of times that community is already kind of like ready-made, or a lot of that infrastructure is already there in a place like New York. So how do we kind of actively build that community in other places for other local art scenes? And so for from my perspective, I want to think about how libraries, archives, and other cultural heritage institutions can help build that infrastructure, but with the understanding that both that those information professionals are responsible and responsive to the needs of the artists and working at this community level rather than kind of imposing some structure or system on top of what the artists are already doing.
Let's all get a cup of coffee. We'll see you after the next session.